Welcome to A Healthy Curiosity, the podcast that explores what it takes to be well in a busy world. With self-care strategies from Chinese medicine, functional medicine, Ayurveda, neuroscience, and beyond. I'm your host, Brody Welch, a licensed acupuncturist and transformation catalyst, here to support you on your journey of health, happiness, and personal evolution. Welcome to today's show. Today is going to be an interesting episode if you are someone who is interested in the way that your body works as an interconnected whole. In Chinese medicine, we, of course, come at this from thinking about the yin and the yang, or the space as well as the substance of who we are. And today we're going to be getting into holistic biomechanics with Alicia Fajardo. Alicia has a BS in exercise science and sports study, and she is certified in a lot of different forms of movement. And she's even created her own Fajardo method of holistic biomechanics. She's been teaching in the movement field for 31 years, and she is based in Portland, Oregon. I recently got turned on to her work through our mutual friend, Katie Silcox, who talked about how when she was doing a ton of yoga, and in fact was like the poster child for yoga and was literally on the cover of Yoga Journal, that her nervous system was not on her side. And that it was, and she really credits Alicia for teaching her something that helped her change her practice and get back on track. Now, I'm always interested in the common myths and mistakes, or like the things that where we try to help ourselves by doing something new, but the fact that one right thing isn't right for everyone. And what if we're doing that thing incorrectly in a way that could be making things worse? And so I always like to look at being able to shed light on anything out there that might help us live differently and optimally. So I'm really excited to learn from my guest today, Alicia Fajardo. Welcome to the show, Alicia.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about how the work you do has evolved into the creation of your own thing.
The work that I do evolved out of an injury that I had when I was teaching, doing personal training and teaching Pilates. I had a dislocated sacrum, and I have my degree in exercise physiology, and I was working in the fitness realm, and I also dance professionally. So I had a lot of information about ways to recover, ways to heal. And I attempted all of those types of movement forms, physical therapy, massage, just about everything. And my body kept making the choice to re-dislocate my sacrum, even if it was put back in by a chiropractor. My body kept making the choice to put it right back to where it had put it originally. And I started to, knowing that the nervous system controls everything, I started to do more research into the nervous system and why my nervous system would be choosing to have my sacrum dislocated. What benefit would that have for me? Because I know the nervous system is survival based. And in looking at all of those things, that's where holistic biomechanics developed from.
I love the way you put that. My body kept making the choice to have my sacrum be out of alignment. Most people probably wouldn't phrase it like that, but that seems like a very intentional way of phrasing. Can you say more about what you mean by that?
The unconscious nervous system, our autonomic nervous system, is always making choices based on the amount of sensory information that it gets. And it always is making choices for the most optimum survival. And a lot of times what happens is that because our sensory information is decreasing, it has to err on the side of caution to create a survival mechanism. And so it chooses one of the survival motor patterns or motor reflexes that exists. It thinks that it's doing the best for us, but it's operating on a really small amount of information.
And that makes so much sense, right? That the autonomic nervous system, this is that part of the nervous system that can either be in fight, flight, freeze, or rest and repair, rest and digest. And we're always going to be prioritizing survival over everything else. obviously, because that's what the species needs to make it. So it's the kind of thing where we talk about that a lot on the show with respect to the fact that if we're not getting a handle on our stress response, it's really hard to fix digestion or to fix sleep or to fix hormone balance, because all of those things are predicated on having a certain amount of balance in the autonomic nervous system and not being in a sympathetic mode all the time. So how does this affect how, like, basically how our bodies show up in space?
There are, in the sympathetic state, there are 7 different stages of motor reflexes that are all triggered. And we can be in one reflex or another. And that actually changes our physical structure. It changes where our bones are, how they relate to each other. It changes the hydration of the fascia, which changes our movement patterning. It changes our ability to use our senses. We have 19 different senses that are neurological. And it starts to diminish a lot of the senses as the further I get into the fight or flight stages. And so it changes our adaptability to our environment. It lessens it. And, from a survival perspective, if I'm getting chased or stabbed, to have less information is great because I only adapt in one way. I only adapt in a survival way. Whereas if I had a lot of information, I might not adapt in that prioritized way of I need to just save the life, save the organs, and go. And so it starts to limit the sensory input. So we really focus on just the main importance of survival.
You just said so much there that I would love to unpack. First of all, 19 different senses?
Yes.
Tell me more.
Everybody knows the basics:
Mhm.
sight, smell, sound, touch. There are senses that we have. We have a sense of hot and cold. We have a sense of wet and dry. We have the sense of proprioception. We have the electromagnetic frequency sense. We have a sense of ultraviolet. We have all different kinds of senses that have to do more with waves that travel through the air. And most people just aren't aware that there's so many more senses that our body uses on a regular basis than just the basics that we know of that we learned in grade school.
And it seems like that's a lot of information that we could be using to keep ourselves in balance, right? I mean, essentially, you're talking about the gunas in Ayurveda, or the is sort of yin yang pairs. And essentially, that if we have access to that, we have information that we could be using to get through life.
Exactly. And our brain just gets, if you think about an old school like switchboard to an operator, instead of just getting, one light lighting up in the brain. And so the brain has to kind of guess as to how it needs to operate based on just that little tiny bit of information. It has thousands of volumes of information coming in. And so it can be the most efficient that it can possibly be because now it's basing its survival mechanism off of thousands of pieces of information about my safety, about how blood is flowing, about how fascia is working, about how hard the ground is, if the ground is wet or dry, is it slick, is it not slick. It has all this information that it can make better choices off of.
And there is, and what you were saying about just that the state of the nervous system dictating how tight the fascia is, or how where the position of our bones and joints, that there really is, that to me harkens back to Candace Pert and Molecules of Emotion, right? That there is no state that we experience emotionally that isn't reflected in every other system of the body. And just how we are, if we're perceiving that there's a threat, of course that's going to be pretty powerful in dictating literally everything, and that's going to be the driver behind how we operate, and potentially implicated in, I could imagine chronic pain, I could imagine hormonal disorders, mood disorders, digestive stuff, really anything, right?
Exactly.
So I have to know, were you able to get your sacrum to stop dislocating?
I would say I wasn't, but my brain got enough information that it
Hmm.
decided that it should relocate my sacrum. And now it uses it in a much more functional way based on the information that it was provided with.
So walk us through a little bit about the work that you do. This is, first of all, I'd love to know how you define holistic biomechanics, but also a little bit about how it works. Like how it seems like there must be a process by which you re-educate your nervous system to not do what it had been doing. Yeah.
Definitely. Holistic biomechanics, as I define it, is just the study of the body as a whole. And
Mm-hmm.
so looking at all the different systems together rather than isolating each system to address it, it's looking at all the different systems of the body together. And from a nervous system perspective, since the nervous system is kind of comes from the brain and it's the major controller of the body, a lot of times when people start to address issues, like for instance, if they have a chronic ache, they might address it muscularly. So they might try and stretch a muscle or they might try and strengthen a muscle, not realizing that the brain is telling the muscle if it needs to be stretched or if it's telling the muscle if it needs to be stronger or if it needs to fire less so that it would be considered weaker. And so rather than starting at the muscle, it's easier to start at the brain and have the brain start to communicate that appropriate signal to like the muscle so that it can start to alleviate some of the chronic pain issues.
I love that. And it makes so much sense, right? If the brain is this top-down controller of what we think is possible for ourselves, like where we think we are in space, how much certainly after an injury, people will have these guarding patterns. But if you were to put them under anesthesia, you could move their range of motion much more than what they think it's physically capable of. And that's the brain, right? Like that's a lot of times where pain lives or where limitations live.
Exactly. Normally, in the process of the brain receiving information comes through the sensory nerves and it travels up the spine and goes into the brainstem. And then it can take one of two paths. It might go to kind of the hindbrain and the amygdala and kind of the emotional centers of the brain. And then I could take that information and compare it to like a past experience or a past event. And then that sets off the whole fight or flight communication system because it's just preparing for whatever I just experienced as if it were a past event. So it's trying to be prepared ahead of time. Or the information can come up through the sensory nerves and it can go to the sensory motor cortex. And when it goes to the sensory motor cortex, the body always sends out a motor response or a change of something in the body in response to any of the sensory information that came in. And so over time, we can change patterns, holding patterns, digestive patterns, fascia fluid patterns by starting to increase the activity at the sensory motor cortex. So the information gets all the way to that sensory motor cortex. And then our body, in response to the sensory information coming in, sends out a whole new motor plan for how the body can be.
So how do we start talking to the sensory motor cortex?
We can't consciously activate our sensory nerves, but there's a lot of research that indicates that if you consciously put your awareness on someplace in the body, that cellular activity in that area starts to increase, neurological activity in that area starts to increase. Our brain has these cells called place and grid cells, and those are the cells that it uses to relate us to not only to ourselves, but also to our external environment. And so if we put our conscious awareness on 2 points of reference, we can do more than two, but it has to be a minimum of two. We start to habituate the sensory nerves and the cellular activity in that general area. The sensory nerves start to send more signals to the brain, and the place and the grid cells start to create a map in relationship to those 2 points. It starts to extrapolate where the body is in space. Some studies show that it can be 500 feet away from you in all directions, so up, down, front, back. And it can realize that you're safe, and then that safety awareness starts to trigger the parasympathetic nervous system.
So is what you're saying that as we are in our bodies, that there's a piece of our awareness that's 500 feet away in all directions?
That's correct. And if you think about driving, when you're driving down the road, and obviously your feet aren't touching the ground, but you can tell when the ground is wet and when it's slippery, and you can get information about the ground without actually touching the ground. You know, your hands are on the steering wheel, your feet's on either the gas pedal or the brake, and your brain extrapolates to the ground. It extrapolates the information from the points of reference of contact that it has, and it can start to pick up that information.
That's a really great analogy because obviously we're not out there touching the ground before we're there, but we're certainly making decisions based on how we should be driving, based on the cues that we're getting from looking down the road and around us. And so Well, I'm curious how body mapping comes into play, because you've mentioned sort of this idea of where we are relative to other things, and that we can relax when we know that we're safe. And body mapping is, at least as far as I'm familiar with it, a way of developing our sense of where we are.
Exactly. It's a developing a sense of where things are in space in relationship to each other. And so, for instance, I can develop a sense of where is my elbow in relationship to my shoulder,
Hmm.
or I can develop a sense of where is my kneecap in relationship to my second toe, or I can develop a sense of where am I in relationship to the seat that I'm sitting on, or where am I in relationship to the wall that's in front of me if I'm inside a room. And so it's the development of where I am in relationship to my environment. Our body map, particularly, is where are the different parts of my body in relationship to each other. And on the sensory motor cortex, there's a body map. So there's real estate given to each part of the body on the sensory cortex, real estate given to each part of the body on the motor cortex, based on the number of nerves that come from that area of the body. And so my brain, for instance, in my hand has a lot of sensory nerves in it and a lot of motor nerves. And so if I were to look at how much real estate the sensory cortex gives to the hand, it's a very large
It's
amount.
huge. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Which isn't what our body looks like. Our
Right.
body doesn't look like it's all hands. But by putting my awareness on different parts of my body and those 2 points of awareness, it can update the brain map to be really accurate.
Calming your nervous system starts with regulating your breath, allowing it to come deep into your lower belly. Feeling calm and confident takes practice, specifically an embodiment practice that allows you to breathe and move from your center. To get access to a super simple breathing and Qigong meditation, visit brodywelch.com/calm. That's brodywelch.com/calm. Enter your email, and a free breathing meditation and super simple Qigong exercise will be delivered to your inbox absolutely free. Thanks for listening. As an acupuncturist, I remember that study about having more of the real estate going to the hands in people who are needling all the time, right? And piano players, like people who need to have sensitivity in their fingertips, develop that sensitivity in their fingertips because that's what they're focused on day in and day out. And so the brain does send it becomes literally more developed in the areas that corresponds
Exactly.
accordingly. And similarly, I can't help but want to mention Qigong here for a couple of reasons. That the first being what you said earlier about how when we think about a particular part of the body, that we are activating neurons in that area, like the brain is trying to connect with that area of the body. And so it's like in Qigong, whenever something is physically uncomfortable, you could do it in your mind and get a similar effect. You can just back off what you're doing physically, but increase the intentionality around it, and you'll still be sort of providing yourself an energetic medicine for that area that is painful, stuck, injured, whatever, because you're literally sending chi there from a Chinese medicine model.
Definitely. It's interesting because from like a pain or an injury perspective, a lot of times when we start to have an injury and we start to get pain or discomfort from that area, we put our attention on that area a lot. And they've discovered that by putting the awareness on the sensation that the body has, it starts to take up more real estate. And they did a study on people who played softball and baseball in their knees. And for the people who had knee, quote, pain and discomfort, they ended up looking at whenever they would touch different parts of the body, how much of it registered in the brain as knee. And for instance, they could touch the person's ankle and that would register as their knee, or they could touch their thigh and it would register as the knee, because the knee map had expanded so much that now it was taking up real estate that normally the foot and the lower leg and the thigh bone would take up. So a lot of times with pain issues, we can kind of map pain in because we pay attention to the injury area so much that its map in the brain expands to such a great degree that now anytime we feel any sensation anywhere, it triggers as that pain reflex in that area of the body.
And I think that explains so much of why certain things like my back pain gets worse when I'm stressed, right? It's like that then I'm feeling my vulnerability. And so I'm looking for it in my body. I'm like, oh yeah, where's that place that often hurts? Oh, there it is. And it's like calling it back in a way. That the idea of forgetting our pain or letting go of it needing to be there, I think is a useful skill.
Or also using the discomfort as a reminder to actually map the structures, the 2 points of reference, so that instead of mapping a sensation, we actually start to focus more on the structure. Anytime we do have the discomfort, it's an indication that something has changed. And so fascia fluid has changed, the structure has changed, the bones have changed position. And so if we go back to the where places versus, oh, this feels like it hurts, if we go, okay, what are 2 points in this area that it hurts? I'm going to pay attention. If it's my back, maybe I'll pay attention to my back hip bone and my thigh bone or a bone in my spine. And I'm just going to put my awareness there for 60 seconds. Then the brain updates the map of that area. So whatever signaling it was sending out that created the discomfort, it can now update the signal, which may change that discomfort.
Oh, that is so cool. That's so cool. And like, I'm immediately going to sort of the mindfulness technique of just getting down to the pure what is without any story over it.
Exactly.
So it sounds like like sort of the anatomical equivalent of that. Like you're just going to those places internally and you're just getting a sense of where things are. And in doing that, you are detaching from this has to hurt. You're giving yourself the security of knowing where you are in space, and that makes things more comfortable.
It does. It triggers a different, for instance, as my brain starts to know where I am at in space, if it's using one of the 7 motor reflexes for the fight or flight, it can change and adapt that to be more suitable. Or it may decide that I'm totally safe and it fires off the parasympathetic state. And in the parasympathetic state, fluid flows more readily, neural signals flow at a more consistent rate. The body opens up, the fascia gets more hydrated. And so again, that might eliminate all the discomfort as well, or it might give my brain more information to pay attention to. So the discomfort isn't so voluminous in my brain. There's more energy coming in, more stimulus coming in. So now that signal seems small in relationship to all the signals that are coming in.
Got it. So, is body mapping something that you assign to your clients?
It is definitely. It's something that we do. And generally, it takes about 7 to 10 days to update a brain map. If I pay attention to something about once an hour, if I spend too much time on the same thing, I can overmap it. So I can make the real estate take up a greater portion versus what is normally attributed to that area. So about every 7 to 10 days, we change up what you're mapping. But it's just to start to get more of your body talking to your brain.
Such a great thing. I love knowing that that's about the amount of time. And so, is there an example that you could use for us of things that people might be dealing with? Maybe it's a pain issue, but maybe it's something like stress or anxiety or insomnia or like just anything that you work with on a regular basis. Is there something that people could do to get started if they were interested in putting into practice some of what you teach?
Definitely. One of the areas that's really close to the brain and it has a ton of sensory nerves is your mouth and your tongue. And so bringing your awareness to the mouth or the tongue is super helpful. The tongue has a tip and it has a tendon. And for some people, the tip of the tongue is really clear. For some people, where the tendon attaches the tongue in the bottom of the throat is really clear. And just bringing your awareness to part of the tongue and another point. For me, with the tip of my tongue, I use the roof of my mouth as a second point. And for me, with the tendon of my tongue, I use my bottom teeth as a reference point. For instance, with the tendon of my tongue, I'll just notice where it is in relationship to my bottom teeth. Is it close to it? It might be further away. And throughout the day, I just watch it and keep giving my brain the information about where it is in space so my brain can extrapolate where my body is in relationship to the rest of its environment from those 2 points of reference. Because the tongue is so close to the head, it doesn't take long for that sensory motor loop to get going.
Again, I'm fascinated by the connection to Qigong here because so often that's the first thing that we'll do before we start a practice is place the tongue behind the upper teeth so that saliva can collect, and there's a different rationale there. But the idea that just tuning in an aware sort of way to that particular posture, we're already starting that may well be why, and in doing so, you're connecting the energetic meridians of the do and the ren that run up the back and down the front of the body. And so there's this idea of kind of like coming into unity within that posture and taking yourself into a bit of relaxation. That's a fascinating little little parallel there.
With the tongue, a
Mhm.
lot of times we can actually do something with it. And it's helpful for the unconscious nervous system to give it time to do something with it versus our consciousness. And so if I do wait about 60 seconds when I put my awareness on the 2 points, it's helpful to wait until you notice a change. You may not be able to label the change, but your unconscious brain should stimulate a change if that sensory motor cortex loop gets going. And so, as somebody is observing the 2 points, it's really, really helpful to kind of keep the observation going until you actually notice a change, even if you can't label what the change is, just until you kind of sense that something's different.
Awesome. So for people out there who might feel like they have maybe they're getting themselves into the situation that Katie got herself into with actually kind of running her nervous system ragged in the practice, in this very strenuous yoga practice. I know that I have definitely made the mistake of, like, I think due to an inaccurate body map, because I felt like I was hurting my back over and over again in yoga. It wasn't until I got away from it and went to a bar studio where there were mirrors where I realized that, oh wow, like when I do a lunge, I had no idea that my pelvis was as wonky as it looks in the mirror. And just having, like, I feel like that was really critical in me actually having a more accurate map of where things were, and be able to eventually get back to doing yoga in a way that wasn't hurting myself over and over again. But I'm wondering if there are people who are out there who are wondering, oh, is this me? Am I making this mistake too? Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, for any movement activity that you participate in, a lot of times, whether it's yoga, Pilates, fitness, gyrotonic, tennis, there are a lot of times a lot of conscious cues and rules that are imposed on the body. For instance, with fitness, if a person's doing a power lift, there's a conscious cue, usually of squeeze your glutes together, pull your belly button towards your spine, and then lift. And with Pilates, there's a navel to spine, and then imprint your back into the mat sometimes, and then move. And in yoga, sometimes there are conscious cues such as where your shoulder blades should be or draw your kneecaps up. Anytime that we do a conscious change of our body posturally, it triggers the fight or flight nervous system, because normally the 85% of the unconscious brain would rule the roost and it would tell the body how to be in response to its environment. And as our conscious brain, the little 15 to 20% of it, dictates how our body should be, our unconscious brain doesn't quite understand that. So it errs on the side of caution and it fires off the fight or flight nervous system. And so, whatever activity that you're doing, if you can avoid doing anything consciously as far as, the cues, and just really allow your unconscious brain to adapt to its environment. And if your shoulder blades need to be up today, let them be up. If your kneecaps aren't supposed to be pulled up today, then maybe you should just allow them to be wherever they need to be. If your glutes want to squeeze together and they do that out of their unconscious choice, that's great. But maybe they don't have to be that way every single time you do the movement. And so rather than allowing our conscious brain to dictate the process, start to give the unconscious brain more credit so it can dictate the process.
I love that idea that our bodies are smart, and that it's like, on the one hand, yes, it's nice to know how to not hurt yourself. And at the same time, too much of that top down control can be really stressful. And that idea of, like, so I would imagine applying that to yoga class, for example, could be taking the shape as a suggestion and taking the cues with a grain of salt, but really getting in touch with ourselves as a physical creature, as an animal, and moving in a way that feels good.
Definitely. And just observing, because every day is going to be different. Every day, the sensory input that your brain receives is different. So the sounds are different, the smells are different, the tactile feeling of the floor is different, which means that every day your body should respond to that information differently. So I can't expect to do a twist the same one day as I do it the next day, because the sensory information is going to be different. And so if my body's in more of the parasympathetic operating mode, it responds to the specific sensory information at hand and sends out a motor response. If I'm in a fight or flight mode, I repeat the same patterns over and over again. And so just to allow myself to not have the expectation that I have to do it the same way every single time, I can allow my sensory input to dictate how I should be doing it and be okay with however it is that day that my brain chooses.
Great. Yeah. So just fundamentally respecting it sounds very compassionate, recognizing that we're not the same as we were yesterday, and being able to be in the moment and act within what's respectful for the body.
Definitely. Giving that unconscious brain a lot of credit.
Yeah, exactly. So what's the potential for the work that you do? Like who could you potentially help with this?
I think it's helpful for anybody. We work with athletes who want to improve their performance, which knowing where their body is in space will help them improve their performance. We work with people who have digestion issues because their fight or flight system is become more dominant throughout the day. And so in the latter stages of fight or flight, digestion slows down, metabolism slows down, the bowel system stops moving, so blood doesn't circulate as well. And so there are people who have digestion issues or circulation issues. There are people who have joint issues. The joints are wearing down, for instance, like knee or hip. And in the first stages of fight or flight that are active, that starts to create a lot of wear and tear on the joints. And so by recognizing what stage of fight or flight I'm in, or if I'm more in the parasympathetic, I can start to make some changes.
So great. And I know we have a fair number of practitioners listening. Is there any advice that you would give to them in terms of how they might be able to apply some of what you do, or just start thinking differently about the work that we might do as body workers, as acupuncturists, as people who work with other people's bodies, yoga teachers, anybody?
It is basically just to acknowledge that the unconscious brain knows the best for every individual. And we, as teachers, movement practitioners, in the cues that we give people, we're only taking in a small portion of sensory input about that person's body. And when their unconscious brain is taking in all of it, it knows everything that's going on. And so, again, just to allow a person to experience it in the way that they need to experience it without giving them criteria or a set of rules about how they should experience it, but also encouraging people to start to pay attention to the 2 points of reference and then allow their body with that 2 points of reference information to make the choices as they move through space, or as they adapt their digestion, or as they, change their sleeping habits.
I really fundamentally love that idea of assuming that you're not the expert, whether whether you're the instructor or the practitioner or even the brain that is trying to dominate your particular body. It's such an empowering message, I think, for us all to hear that our bodies have wisdom and that we can trust them, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Alicia, I've learned so much from you today, and if people are interested in connecting with you, how would they go about doing that?
Email is the best way. And my email address is transformationspdx@gmail.com.
All right, I'll make sure to throw a link to that in the show notes. Alicia, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your pioneering method with us today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening today. To check out the show notes, get on my email list, or drop me a line, head to brodywelch.com. That's Brody with an IE and Welch with a CH. I'd love to hear from you. If you learned something new or feel inspired to try something different in your life, I'd love for you to pay it forward by sharing this episode with a friend who you think could also benefit, and give them a reason to listen. You'll be helping to create a world where we encourage each other to embody self-respect. Till next time, be good to yourself.